Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin.
Damage right after he did that.
Never knowing those things, but Pete's a very, very good man. I hope he makes it. I hope he makes it.
All of this happening as President Trump is in California tonight, where he toured the fire damage with the First Lady. In a press conference just earlier tonight, President Trump declared the fires a national emergency.
The federal government standing behind you, 100%. The First Lady and I are in California to express a great love for the people of California.
Earlier in the day, President Trump signaled he may make major changes to FEMA or even eliminate it if he can, leading to this tense exchange.
FEMA doesn't even show up. It takes weeks before they even show up. And what happens is the state then relies on...
Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Budd, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy.
Yeah, so this vote just opened moments ago, Phil. It's going to be open for a little bit later on into the hour. That's how the Senate goes. It can be a relatively slow process. Right now, Pete Hegseth has 2 Republican no votes, and all Democrats have said that they're going to vote against him as well. That means that Pete Hegseth can only afford to lose 1 more Republican, because Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, 2 moderate Republicans have said they don't like Pete Hegseth. They have issues with his character, as Murkowski said. Collins said she didn't believe certain comments that Pete Hegseth made about walking back comments he'd previously made about not supporting women in combat, that she didn't believe Pete Hegseth has changed his views on women. They both issued statements in which they really gave this laundry list of issues that they have with Pete Hegseth at the top job in the Pentagon. But nonetheless, they're the only 2 no votes. If there's a 3rd no vote amongst the Republicans, that would mean that J.D. Vance, the vice president, would have to come in and break the tie, as is the vice president's role in the Senate. It would mean Hegseth would still get confirmed. But if there were 4 Republican no votes, that would put Pete Hegseth on track to lose. We know of no other public no votes at this hour other than Collins and Murkowski, but we're keeping a close eye on the Senate floor to see what some of these tight-lipped Republicans would do. Certainly, we have a close eye on Mitch McConnell, the former top Republican in the Senate. He has been characteristically tight-lipped about what he is going to do. He has not made really any kind of public support statement in support of Pete Hegseth. He has not said whether or not he's going to vote yes or no, although he voted yes yesterday on a procedural vote as it relates to Hegseth. So keep an eye on Mitch McConnell. Keep an eye on Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who has said over the course of this process that he's doing his quote-unquote due diligence into Pete Hegseth. But right now, if all things hold and there are no new no votes, it puts Pete Hegseth on track to lead the Pentagon, Phil. And as you said, Pete Hegseth is here on Capitol Hill making this rare appearance, very unusual for a nominee to come here to the Hill to watch his or her confirmation vote. But Pete Hegseth and his family here tonight to do just that, Phil.
And Jay, in your experience, you have Murkowski and Collins coming out saying no yesterday for the preliminary vote. But in your experience, do people stay quiet and then vote no at the actual vote for confirmation? And then I would put this on it, especially in the Trump era, when he has threatened to primary anybody who goes against him.
Well, I think a lot of our experience doesn't necessarily hold up, Phil, in a situation that is this unique, in that it is very rare for a Secretary of Defense nominee to have any kind of this level of opposition. These nominees are typically confirmed with broad bipartisan support. Lloyd Austin was President Biden's pick to run the DOD. James Mattis was Donald Trump's last pick to run the DOD, who went through a confirmation process. They got Democratic votes, not just Republican votes, or in Lloyd Austin's case, got Republican votes, not just Democratic votes. So to have a nominee of this caliber for a job this central come down to such a narrow confirmation vote as Pete Hegseth is doing is incredibly rare. For a vote of this nature, you don't usually have to watch one or two holdout votes, as I was just describing, because they typically sail to confirmation for a role that is this central and, frankly, this bipartisan. So if Pete Hegseth were to get confirmed tonight, even with just 2 Republican no votes, it would mean that he would be confirmed with one of the narrowest margins for a defense secretary in modern American history, Phil.
And we've reported extensively, you have reported extensively on the controversies surrounding Hegseth. If he does get this position, which he seems poised to do, what challenges will he face as the new Secretary of Defense with such a slim margin for confirmation?
Well, certainly he's going to have a Congress keeping a close eye on him based upon his record and his background. He has made it clear to senators that he says he is a changed man, and therefore previous mistakes he may have made, infidelities that he alleges or he admits to having had, drinking, although he doesn't say that he has a drinking problem. Hegseth has said he would not drink if he took the top job in the Pentagon. Hegseth has denied allegations of sexual assault dating back to 2017, pointing to the fact that there were no criminal charges brought. But, you know, Democratic senators are keeping a close eye on that, and Republican senators say they walked through those allegations as well. Point being, there's going to be a close eye on his tenure, given all of that personal history that factored in this confirmation. But also, he's got to make good on these sweeping promises of President Trump's significant reform at the Pentagon, doing away with certain diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at DOD, as Donald Trump has pledged to do in a number of federal agencies. Point being, for Pete Hegseth, he's got to make good on this sweeping Trump agenda, having not really had any kind of a senior national security role before. And not just that, Pete Hegseth has never had a senior role at a company of this size. The Pentagon is the largest employer in the United States, employing 3 million people, from active duty military to reservists to civilian contractors. Pete Hegseth has never had any kind of a comparable role leading an organization of that size. That's why Democrats and Murkowski and Collins said they didn't believe he was qualified for this role. But if he gets through this confirmation, he's going to have to prove them wrong, Phil.
All right, Jay O'Brien, we know you're keeping an eye on the vote. We'll get back to you when the news warrants. In the meantime, joining me now is Matt Gorman, former senior communications advisor to Senator Tim Scott, and ABC contributor Amanda Renteria, who's a Democratic strategist and CEO of Code for America. Matt, I want to begin with you. This confirmation process for Hegseth has been particularly contentious. Allegations, as Jay was just laying out, of sexual misconduct, excessive drinking, clouding much of this nomination. Do you think this hurts his standing with the Republican Party or in the MAGA movement long term?
Hegseth, no, not at all. Because look, let's face it, at the end of the day, much like another contentious confirmation hearing, which candidly this reminded me a lot of, was Brett Kavanaugh. At the end of the day, once they're confirmed, they're serving on the court, or in this case, obviously the Pentagon, in good standing until they choose not to anymore. I mean, these things can get ugly. These can get contentious and controversial, as we've certainly seen it will. But once they're in the job, they're in the job, barring some sort of other issues. And so that's the big hurdle he has to clear. That's why these things are so contentious, because once he's in, it's very hard to get him out.
And Amanda, though a few Republican senators ended up voting against at least the procedural vote yesterday, and they say they're going to vote against his nomination tonight, what do you make of the fact that Democrats tried, couldn't stop what looks to be his confirmation? It seems to be a numbers game at this point.
Well, we'll see where this ends up, but I think it's important to note that this is unusual in all kinds of different ways. This is not a role that you usually have bipartisan opposition, even on a procedural basis. And so we've never seen anything quite like this before. And I actually do think it affects their ability when they are in office, because you can imagine that This is different than Kavanaugh in that this is the kind of role where you do brief the Congress, where you do talk through what are the different strategies and policies, and you need to have a good, trusting, credible relationship with Congress in order to move forward. And so as we look at this vote, I think it is if he gets through, it will be a different kind of relationship than Congress has ever had with someone in this role, not to mention having him there in the office. And I've been on the floor for many of these kinds of votes. It's quite unusual to have him up in the gallery while this is happening, and it's so close.
And this is for both of you. More confirmation hearings, obviously, starting soon with other nominees like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. What are your predictions there? And I know, this is just, you don't have a crystal ball. We're reading the tea leaves here. Matt, I want to begin with you.
Yeah, no, look, I think what we've seen here tonight is that Republicans can vote against nominees. I mean, Collins voting against a Republican nominee is not a surprise. She voted against Betsy DeVos during Trump's first term. She needs to do that for her base in Maine, a blue state. Murkowski is obviously a moderate, voted against Kavanaugh, and a couple other nominees as well throughout the Trump time. Not a surprise. Gabbard, barring any other unforeseen thing, it's going to have a contentious hearing, much like RFK, but likely to get through. Again, caveat, some things we don't know. But right now, as we're seeing tonight, 4 GOP no votes that would kill a nominee is a very high bar. It's not easily cleared.
And Amanda, to you, what about those specific two, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr.?
So there's a couple things that one is true. Math is math, right? So the numbers are and the votes are what they are. And it's true. 4 is a high bar. Tulsi Gabbard's an interesting candidate because she already has relationships in Congress, and they haven't necessarily been positive. So it makes it a little bit unusual of a candidate because people have been uncomfortable with some of the actions, who she's met with when she's gone on trips. So it's a little bit different. We'll see how this plays out. But I will say the vote here will really send a message on how much are Republicans willing to follow where Trump wants to go. Therefore, if Pete gets through, there's likely to be a reality that most are getting through simply because of the math.
Yeah, and is that math made more difficult? And Matt, you mentioned this. It depends on you're talking about the districts that people come from. There's a great deal of pressure from the White House that has a mandate going into this next 4 years from the American people, winning all the swing states and the popular vote. That if you don't back the president and his nominees, that you could face a primary.
Let's face fact, right? Trump is at the zenith of his power right now. He's never been more personally popular. His job approval is above 50%. So if you're going to go against Trump now, I mean, that says a lot, right? And I know this firsthand, right? Collins has to buck some nominees, as we saw when she ran a very underdog race and impressively pulled out in 2020. She did so by being Maine-centered, not necessarily Trump or a Republican senator. I think that is key. And again, even McConnell, and that's a leap, candidly, to say that he's going to vote against some of these nominees. There's been no evidence of that. He voted for cloture last night, as you mentioned, with Hegseth. Who's the fourth? Like that's the issue here. Even if those 3 fall in line, that fourth person, it's hard to find someone to do that. And that's just the facts of it.
All right, Matt, Amanda, thank you both very much. We'll continue to watch this vote tonight. In fact, I want to go right now to Jay O'Brien on Capitol Hill. Jay, you've got some breaking news to report.
Phil, and forgive me for looking down at my phone. I just want to make sure I get this statement right. We just got a statement in the form of a post on X from Senator Thom Tillis. And you heard me mention him earlier on in the broadcast. Thom Tillis was one of those votes that we were watching because, again, Pete Hegseth cannot afford to lose 4 Republican votes. And he's already got 2, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski. They have said there are no. We were watching Mitch McConnell as a possible 3rd. We have not seen whether or not he has voted yes or no yet. And we were watching Thom Tillis as a possible 4th. Thom Tillis, before he walked out onto the Senate floor, just posted on X that he has been, dropping my phone. There we go. That he's been clear, he says, from the beginning that he would give deference to President Trump and his nominees. nominees, meaning if Donald Trump picks someone, that Tom Tillis would give significant weight to the fact that that person was President Trump's choice. He says of Pete Hegseth's nomination, quote, "I conducted my own due diligence, including asking tough questions of Pete, and I appreciate his candor and his openness in answering them." And then he goes on to signal that he is going to support Pete Hegseth. It was Tom Tillis yesterday who told reporters that new allegations leveled by Pete Hegseth's ex-sister-in-law, that Pete Hegseth's ex-wife was afraid for her safety around her then-husband, gave Tillis a reason to say that he was going to dig deeper into those and do quote-unquote due diligence into those additional allegations. Now, Pete Hegseth has denied those allegations. He's denied allegations that he committed sexual assault in 2017. He's denied allegations that he had a drinking problem. He's denied allegations that he mismanaged veterans' charities. What Tillis says is that he went through each of those, conducted due diligence into each of those, and he has said that after looking into all of that and after kind of frankly dragging all of this out and keeping us into suspense as to which way he was leaning, he's going to vote yes on Pete Hegseth. So if there are no other no votes, even if there's a third no vote, even if Mitch McConnell, we've been keeping an eye on, does ultimately cast a no vote, which is not a done deal at this hour, that means Pete Hegseth is on track to being confirmed. Now, if there are 3 no votes, it means that J.D. Vance, the vice president, as is the vice president's role in the Senate, would have to come in and cast that tie-breaking vote, and it would mean Hegseth would only squeak by to confirmation, but still, he would win confirmation. The vote's not final yet. No votes are locked in yet, but it's a good sign for Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, and Tom Tillis, as you said, your words, you sort of dragged it out. He did make folks believe, and if you believe his words, of course, he did his due diligence and he's giving deference to the president. But in the end, it appears he's going to vote the way most Republicans are going to vote. So it really is immaterial sort of what Mitch McConnell does at this point, it would seem. But I'm wondering, Jay, if this is the way this contentious hearing ends, if this is the way it's going to end, what do you think that means for a Tulsi Gabbard and our RFK Jr.?
Well, that's an excellent question, Phil, because they now have their confirmation hearings set for next week. Oh, wait, Phil, just got it. Mitch McConnell is a no. Mitch McConnell just cast a no vote for Pete Hegseth, which means now Pete Hegseth has 3 public no votes. Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and now Mitch McConnell, the former top Senate Republican who bent his Senate Republican conference to his will when he was leading that body. Now, no longer in a leadership role, now just a senator of Kentucky, albeit a powerful senator from Kentucky. He is a no vote on Pete Hegseth, which means Hegseth has 3 Republican no votes. And if there's not a 4th, which it looks like there might not be if Tom Tillis isn't a no and we don't get any other surprises, it means they're going to have to bring J.D. Vance into that chamber and cast the tie-breaking vote, Phil. Now, to your question earlier, what it means for some of other Donald Trump's controversial cabinet picks, they have their confirmation hearings set for next week. RFK Jr. does, as does Tulsi Gabbard, as does Kash Patel, Donald Trump's pick to run the FBI. And they are considered this second tranche of nominees. And there are senators looking at them very quizzically, especially Tulsi Gabbard, because there are senators who have privately expressed concern about Tulsi Gabbard's past comments about Russia, in line with Kremlin talking points at times, about her past relationship with Bashar al-Assad of Syria, having met with him even after he gassed his own people. And so watch for those issues to come up in her confirmation hearing and some other thorny issues to come up in Kash Patel's hearing, as well as RFK Jr.'s.
You know, sometimes, Jay, during these votes, a powerful senator, the way he or she votes, it can sort of be permission for someone else to go in that direction. I'm wondering what you think of the timing of getting those statements, the timing of Tom Tillis and then McConnell right after, maybe perhaps having permission to go in the other direction. And are you surprised? Is it a surprise that Mitch McConnell voted the way he voted?
Well, Mitch McConnell had always been tight-lipped all week about his decision, Phil, and I had shouted questions at him repeatedly in the hallway, and as Mitch McConnell so often does, he just smirked, he raised his eyebrow, and he walked on by. You know, he knew more than what he was prepared to tell us. And you'll have to forgive me for consistently looking down at my phone. That's how I get updates from the floor, because the floor is all the way over there. So give me 1 second as I look down. But essentially, Phil, to your point, although we are at the Capitol, by the way, we're in the Cannon House office building building if you care. But my point is that for Mitch McConnell, it was always somewhat expected in the Republican conference in the Senate that he was going to cast this vote this way. He had never said it publicly, but we were keeping a close eye on him because of A, how tight-lipped he'd been, and B, that his worldview doesn't typically align with Pete Hegseth. Mitch McConnell is someone who is a defense hawk. He now sits on a key defense appropriations subcommittee, which, by the way, is going to be integral in working with Pete Hegseth's Pentagon if Pete Hegseth were to be confirmed. And he's someone who has typically supported those with requisite national security experience, and Pete Hegseth has never served in any kind of a senior national security role. And even President Trump earlier on today seemed to indicate that he thought Mitch McConnell would probably break ranks with his fellow Republicans and vote against Pete Hegseth. But nonetheless, it does carry weight. It does carry power to have the former leader of the Senate Republicans vote against a pick of Donald Trump's for such a key role. But another thing you got to keep in mind here, Phil, is that Mitch McConnell is no longer the leader of Senate Republicans. John Thune is. And as I was discussing with some of my colleagues earlier, including our Miriam Khan, who covers the Capitol, and our Ali Pecorin, our Senate producer, who also covers the Capitol with us, it's unclear if John Thune would have brought this action to the floor if he didn't think he had the votes to get it over the goal line, even if those votes ultimately came with a tie-breaking vote from J.D. Vance.
Yeah, the math here is always important to bring the vote to the floor. Jay, first of all, you don't ever have to apologize to having one eye on your phone and one eye on the camera, because that's how you report. We've seen you chase people down the hallways and do 6 different things at the same time. So keep looking at your phone, keeping us up to date. I do want to ask you this. You talked about Tom Tillis. And we know which way he is voting. You talked about Mitch McConnell. You know which way he's voting. I didn't hear any other names. Would anybody else coming forward and voting no surprise you?
Not really. Well, it would be incredibly surprising, excuse me. When I say not really, I mean to say we're not tracking anyone who is a possible no vote, so it would be incredibly surprising to see someone that was not those names that we just listed. And it's interesting because when you reference the no votes, one of the things we had seen just yesterday is we got our first public no votes yesterday. It was only yesterday that we learned for sure that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski were going to be no votes, because there was a key procedural vote on Pete Hegseth yesterday. It wasn't the official vote. The official vote's happening now, but it was a key procedural vote. And so we were watching that closely as a bellwether to see what the no votes would be. Mitch McConnell was a yes on that key procedural no vote, but a no vote on the official vote tonight. And the sense we get is that's just because Mitch McConnell didn't want to be obstinate in a way that he didn't need to be. But Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski clearly from yesterday into today staking a claim as to saying that they don't believe Pete Hegseth is qualified or should serve in this role or can serve in this role. Both of them issued lengthy statements, Phil, where they walked through their various issues with Pete Hegseth. Murkowski talked about those allegations of sexual assault and excessive drinking, et cetera, which Pete Hegseth denies, said that they gave her pause. She said that she doesn't think that he has the necessary experience to run the Pentagon. She referenced his comments about women in the military, comments he had made in other venues like podcasts saying that he doesn't believe women should serve in combat, comments that he walked back during his confirmation hearing, in part due to questioning from Joni Ernst, a sexual assault survivor and a combat veteran, now the senator from Iowa, who after that hearing came out and said that she liked Pete Hegseth's answers and she was going to support him. She was seen as kind of a key bellwether vote as well. And Susan Collins said that she just didn't believe Pete Hegseth's answer there when he walked that back and said that women would still serve in combat roles in his Pentagon if, quote unquote, the standards remained high, as Pete Hegseth said. So they had serious issues with them. They walked through them in length, clearly a message to us in the news media to try to answer some of our questions as to how they would vote, but also a message to their colleagues as to say at the 11th hour, these are our issues with him. Would you potentially get on board with us?
So many things come into consideration for a member to vote, and Mitch McConnell has not been afraid to be at odds with the president in the past, and quite frankly, he's not looking at a 30-year career ahead of him like some of these other senators are who would not want to get primaried. Jay, just before we let you go and take an actual look at this vote, take us through what would happen now with the vice president.
So if there are 3 no votes, and they're not locked in yet because this vote isn't over, when the vote is officially over is when we get the official count. The Senate takes a long time to vote. But if that were to happen and we had 3 no votes and it were a tie, then J.D. Vance would have to come stand there in the well of the Senate, or rather at the podium there in the Senate at the rostrum, and give an aye vote and put it over the goal line. We saw Kamala Harris do that time after time after time when she was vice president on contentious pieces of legislation that were going to come down to the wire. Now we will see J.D. Vance do it for the first time as vice president on a controversial nominee, Phil.
All right, those kind of margins, that's what we get. Jay O'Brien, thank you very much. We'll get back to you in just a minute. I want to bring back in Matt and Amanda now. Matt, Amanda, we have a little bit more information now with Tom Tillis and Mitch McConnell. I want your thoughts on Mitch McConnell. Amanda, I'll start with you.
You know, listen, this is the former Senate Majority Leader, and he still has quite a bit of relationships within the body. It matters that he's a no on this. It is telling that he is a no on this. It's also telling that he waited, right? He clearly didn't want to influence other people's votes, but now when it comes down to the wire, you are required to put a yes or no by your name. And I think it is interesting, especially for such an important role in the United States. This is a big deal to be watching right now.
And Matt, I want your thoughts on the way Mitch McConnell had voted. And to Amanda's point, why would he not want to influence?
I think it's very interesting, candidly surprising that he voted against. I was very surprised when Jay mentioned that. I also thought the timing was notable, right? I think in some respects he didn't want to be the deciding vote, the one that would make a Hegseth nomination go down, per se. Because again, he is still the leader, or I should say, he still has a pulse of his caucus. So he let the person, Tom Tillis, in a competitive race out in North Carolina, get in front of him, assure the confirmation was, going to happen, and then drift in the wake of this. I thought that was notable. The timing too. This is like a man who still understands very acutely the politics of the Senate, and the timing of it, I took note of, and I think we saw that clearly.
Yeah, that was my first thought, too. I mean, he's a keen political operator and, as you say, has the pulse on the caucus. And it was literally, 30 seconds to a minute, I think, after Tom Tillis released that on X. That's how quickly Jay gave us that statement. I'm wondering, and Jay and I talked a little bit about this, but Amanda, I'm wondering if you think there's anybody left, on the floor of the Senate who could cast a no vote tonight.
It's hard to see, but again, people have this is one of the first major votes and big tests for the Republican Party and leaders. And so if you were a no vote, what I have seen in the Senate, particularly at this moment, is you hold tight. And, it is true. No one wants to be their last vote. But again, this is a major, major role in the United States government that will decide the direction of our defense, of our military at such a critical time. And so if anyone is out there trying to figure out what to do, I understand that it could go up to the very wire because of how important this is right now, this moment for our country right now.
And Matt, I'm wondering if you think there's anybody left there who I'm not going to use the word courageous, but it would be a risky political move at this point with the amount of power that the president has, the White House, the Senate, the Congress. Do you think there's anybody left there who could possibly vote no tonight?
No, it's done. I mean, Hegseth will be confirmed, obviously now with JD as a tie-breaking vote. One thing to watch for, right? We talked about Tulsi, we talked about RFK. Use a lesson from Matt Gaetz. If we get to the point where individual senators, Murkowski, Collins, and now McConnell, are doing floor statements and, public press releases opposing nominees, that should tell you that they know they're the outliers in here. It's when, candidly, we had this earlier with Hegseth where there was a little bit of question. When clusters of senators behind the scenes start bringing concerns to the Trump administration before things get to the floor, that belies that there's actually more people that are behind that could possibly be opposed. That's when you know a nomination could possibly be in trouble. If you get to the stage where Susan Collins is doing floor speeches, cake is very close to baked. That's one little rule of thumb for the future.
I asked you both specifically about Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. You did mention, Jay mentioned Kash Patel. I want to ask you both about Kash Patel because each of these nominees come with baggage, as virtually every nominee does. But specifically, I'm wondering if you think Kash Patel will receive even more pushback than Hegseth found. Amanda, I'll start with you.
I think it's going to be really interesting if this nomination goes through, whether it becomes either, I suspect people are going to feel, particularly when you think about McConnell, when you think about people who are on that edge, whether they can do it again. At some point when you are being asked, and I remember this right when Obama came in, when there are votes and you're wondering about them or you're on the edge, you only have so much of a bank account for that. And so it is going to be interesting to see what happens with these next nominees. But I also want to say those meetings with senators directly, what they say and what kind of relationship they build really matters. And so we'll see how those happen. And you start to get a sense of it when senators come out of the meetings, whether they say, oh, that was really great, I didn't know this about this candidate. And so it's going to be on how well can each of these candidates come in who aren't known, like Kash Patel, who aren't known, what kind of relationship and trust do they build with folks who are going to put their name, their vote on the line for this particular candidate.
I want to bring Jay O'Brien back in. Jay, you're watching the vote. Where are we at right now?
Yeah, so Phil, it is tied 50-50, which means if nobody changes their vote, which they can under the Senate procedure, but it's highly unlikely, it means that right now we're watching our screen, as you see it there on yours, to see when J.D. Vance will walk out to the floor and cast this tie-breaking vote. Again, as you have been discussing with everybody, 3 Republican no votes, Collins, Murkowski, and now Mitch McConnell, who kept his thoughts tight-lipped before he walked out onto the floor and cast that not so surprise no vote and tied it up. So it's 50-50. Again, J.D. Vance has got to break this tie. And it puts Pete Hegseth on track to being confirmed, but it would be with a slim margin. As you and I have discussed, but it's worth reminding our viewers now because we are at that tie-breaking point in the evening. Secretaries of Defense are typically confirmed with broad bipartisan margin. We're talking 90-plus votes, not 51-50. We're talking 98-2 and stuff like that. I was looking at previous secretaries of defense today, and they were all confirmed, save for one during the Obama administration in recent political history with broad bipartisan support. And so this is a rarity. It puts Pete Hegseth on track to be one of just a handful of secretaries of defense since about the mid-1970s who have gone into the Pentagon running that department with such a slim margin of victory in the Senate, Phil.
And just for our viewers who are not sort of locked into this kind of procedure, let's talk about the locked in. When do these votes get locked in? Take us through the actual, is that all we're waiting for, J.D. Vance to come out and vote and then it's locked in?
Yes, that's correct, Phil. We are waiting for J.D. Vance to come in, and then the vote would be finalized after he were to cast that tie-breaking vote. There's a couple things to keep in mind. We weren't certain that J.D. Vance was in the building when I stepped out in front of this camera about a half hour ago. Let me just ask off camera. Is he in the building, Miriam Khan? My producer, Miriam Khan, standing off camera. We don't know if J.D. Vance is in the building. We saw a large security presence earlier on in the evening, and myself and other reporters gathered at one of the doors to the Senate right behind me here to see who was coming in, and it was Pete Hegseth instead of J.D. Vance. And I shouted to Pete Hegseth, how do you feel about tonight? Do you think you have the votes, et cetera, et cetera? All he did was put a thumbs up. Worth pointing out, Phil, that's incredibly rare for a cabinet pick to come to the Senate and watch their confirmation votes roll in. That does not typically happen. Incredibly rare, part of a string of rare things that have happened during this administration over the last week or so. But to your question about J.D. Vance, we were not aware even a half hour ago and up until tonight if he was in the building and prepared to cast the tie-breaking vote or if he was just in the area. We knew he was in Washington. We knew he was being held held back in Washington because of the possibility that he would need to be rushed here to the Capitol to cast this tie-breaking vote. But we're a little bit playing right now, where in the world is the vice president to come finish this vote?
Well, I'll tell you where he is on social media, Jay. He's on X, and just a minute ago he posted, I thought I was done voting in the Senate, with a crying face emoji. So he knows what he has to do, whether or not he's in that building or not. But yeah, he posted that. So much of how we hear from politicians these days, as you saw the Tom Tillis, his explanation come in on X. This too, J.D. Vance just a minute or so ago posting on X, I thought I was done voting in the Senate, with a laughing face, laughing so hard he's crying face. And he will no doubt be on the way to Senate, whether he's there or not. I guess we're going to have to wait. And so just procedurally, Jay, this doesn't end until the vice president, wherever he is, gets to the Senate floor and makes that vote.
And Phil, just as a point of levity, because why can't we have fun, right? We're just waiting on J.D. Vance. As you read that tweet live on the air, our producer, Mariam Khan, who's kneeling right off camera on a marble floor next to me, read it to me word for word as you were reading it. It was one of the strangest experiences of my evening. But yes, that tweet is real. J.D. Vance now prepared to come cast that vote. And we're in this holding pattern now of when he's going to walk out onto the floor and make this official. Frankly, Phil, it's hard to believe that he wasn't already either in the building or close by. It's very much unclear at this hour if the White House or if Senate leadership knew how Mitch McConnell was going to vote, and he was going to be that final third no vote if all the votes hold once it gets finalized, and actually turn this into a tie. We know, for instance, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski had said that when they did their first no vote yesterday on what was the procedural vote on Pete Hegseth that came before tonight's vote, they alerted Senate leadership and John Thune, now the top Republican in the Senate, to the fact that they were going to come out and they were going to cast a no vote so that Senate leadership wasn't surprised. That's a very typical Senate thing to do. It's a place that's run on everybody getting along, essentially. It's unclear if Mitch McConnell, though, tipped anyone off in leadership or at the White House, and he's had an acrimonious relationship over the years with Donald Trump, but if he tipped anyone off in Senate leadership or at the White House to his vote. J.D. Vance is in the building, is that right? All right, I'm told J.D. Vance is in the building. Is he on the floor? J.D. Vance has just walked by the doors right off the Senate floor, Phil, I'm told. And so he's imminent to be stepping out onto the floor in your camera feed there.
Yeah, and we're watching the floor, so we'll see him do that. Jay, staying in your moment of levity, if that was part of one of the strangest things that happened to you on Capitol Hill tonight, that says something, because you live in a strange world there often. I want to ask you about the vice president. This is a big moment for the vice president. They just took office. This is his first deciding vote, split decision vote, and it's a big one.
Yeah, and the question, Phil, is it the first of more to come? Because Republicans still have a decent-sized control over the Senate. They certainly have a better Senate majority than Democrats did in the previous Congress. But still, it's a slim majority. And as we see tonight, 3 votes can turn it all into upheaval. It's nothing like the House, where Mike Johnson is playing with an even slimmer majority. Once everybody who's been nominated to the Trump cabinet resigns, Mike Johnson is going to be playing with a 2-seat majority, a 217 to a 215 majority, until some of those seats can be filled with special elections. So that will be challenging for him. But certainly John Thune has his work cut out for him as well in wrangling this Senate Republican conference. And so the question facing J.D. Vance is this going to be his first tie-breaking vote of this second Trump administration?
Yeah, and we know you talk about the Congress. The Congress is a much different animal. There, you have so many things. We watch the Republican caucus have trouble even nominating or picking a leader there. So yeah, we're watching that slim majority as well. We're still watching the floor. I have not seen the vice president. He will no doubt go to that table to cast his vote. Do I still have Amanda and Matt? I do? Okay. Amanda, Matt, I would just like to bring you guys back in. You see what's happening. You're watching it. You hear Jay's reporting. This will most likely end in a 51-50 split. Jay's talking about how just remarkable it is that someone in this position looks like it will be confirmed with such a close vote. Just, Matt, start and give us some perspective on that.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's a symptom of the fact that you have obviously polarized, but you have a president who feels very confident and empowered, and he picks someone who I think is plainly more controversial than a lot of other nominees were. I mean, this is someone he trusts. He's someone he feels is qualified, but it is more controversial, clearly. And so, but he obviously feels and felt empowered to do it. And I think through the power of his own party, was able to get this through on obviously the slimmest of margins.
And Amanda, Matt Gaetz was one of the first out of the gate, so to speak, and that didn't work out. And a lot of people in Washington thought perhaps that might be something that happens again. We haven't seen that. Pam Bondi was very popular. And now Pete Hegseth was the next up, who was, say, even in the area of the same controversial kind of nominee, and it looks like that will be a 51-50 split tonight the minute the vice president walks out there onto the floor. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think everyone recognizes, as we were talking about before, math. When you have a 4-vote margin and you have the vice president's vote coming in, I suspect we are going to see this a lot more because Republicans as well are trying to figure it out. I do think it's unusual for a former Senate Majority Leader to vote no, and for the White House to not have been ready for that. So it's clear that there's some work to be done on the Republican side to figure out how do they continue to get the votes, how do they build the communication a lot tighter. But there's some angst because this is so unusual. And I think that's the part that I think we're all going to get used to saying is how rare this administration is and the kinds of ways and procedures and who they put up and how they lead. And it'll be a test for this body going forward in what to do with the unusual.
And Matt, you're former senior communications advisor to Senator Tim Scott. I know you're not out there voting tonight, but I'm wondering, what do you think about Pete Hegseth's qualifications?
I mean, obviously, it was different than most of the kind of people we've had in the past. I think it's a good thing, candidly, whether it was Mattis or Lloyd Austin. I was nervous that we'd gotten to the point where we're just taking leaders right from service, giving them waivers like each of them had gotten, and then putting them right back in. I think we have a civilian-led military. We need to reinforce that no matter what. I think number two, this is certainly someone, you heard this consistently through the confirmation hearings. Clearly, he felt his differentiation was he actually had served. He actually had been on the ground, on the front lines, and that was something that differentiated him from a lot of people who had done this job previously or people that he beat out for this nomination. I think clearly going into this office now in the Pentagon, he's going to bring that with him.
And Amanda, give us some historical perspective. I mean, I hear what Matt is saying, and every candidate for one of these positions is going to come with some baggage. But setting aside some of the controversies that we saw surrounding Hegseth, what does it say that someone with his qualifications, whether you believe he's qualified or not, is most likely going to step into this position in this administration?
Well, we do know that he's never had the experience of running something like this, the Pentagon. I appreciate the service, but this is actually an organization of this kind of size with geopolitics really in a very precarious place. And we're bringing in, or this administration is bringing someone in without the kind of experience who has been at those kinds of tables before, with the weight of where our country is going to be in a very tumultuous time. I'm nervous. He will have his shot. And like you'll hear from most senators after this vote, everybody needs this person to be successful. But this is a big job for someone who really hasn't had the experience and qualifications that we have seen in the past. And in addition, doesn't have the kind of support going into this role as we're seeing right now with J.D. Vance having to break this tie.
Yeah, you're right. We've already heard that from Senator Blumenthal tonight. We interviewed him earlier on in the evening, and he said, I'm totally not voting for him. However, if he gets in, I want him to be successful. And of course, every American would. We need that person to be successful, whoever it may be. Matt, I want to ask you this. If there were senators who were, and it was so far 3 that have voted no against Hegseth, do you think this makes it less likely for people who have a hesitation or even outright concern about a Tulsi Gabbard or an RFK Jr. or a Kash Patel to come forward and vote their conscience?
I think 2 things. I think I actually agree with what Amanda said. If you're Susan Collins, if you're Lisa Murkowski, you can't vote against every Trump nominee that's controversial. Again, Collins is in 2 years, or I guess a little less than 2 years now. In order to protect her right flank, she can't vote against Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK all at once. You only have so many of these. So she is going to be strategic. Maybe this is the only one she votes against. Maybe if there's one other one, max. But again, what I would look for more than anything else is, do you start seeing rumblings about Tulsi, RFK, or Kash before they get voted out of committee? That is the key here. That would tell me that it's not just 1 or 2 Republican senators, but a few more, a block even, that would be opposing. And we haven't heard that as of yet.
I want to bring Jay back in from Capitol Hill. Jay, I'm still watching the floor. I know you are too. Have your producers told you where the vice president is? We still don't know yet.
J.D. Vance ain't there, Phil. Where is J.D. Vance? No one has any idea.
I never thought I'd hear you use the word ain't, but you did, nonetheless.
It's getting cold out here, Phil. It's getting cold out there.
You want the vote to be over. I understand.
I'm just kidding.
We all do. Jay, talk me through where we go from here with the next nominees.
Yeah, so the Senate is going to work this weekend, which is rare for the United States Senate, because Republicans have said they want to move these Trump nominees as fast as the Senate procedure will allow them, because frankly, they're under pressure from the White House to do so. Democrats were going to try to strike a deal with Republicans today to actually move this vote up, so it wasn't going to be a 9 p.m. vote on Pete Hegseth, but instead they would move it into the early evening. And the flip side of that deal was that everybody gets to go home this weekend, and the Senate doesn't have to stay and vote on Donald Trump's other nominees over the course of this weekend. And a weekend is a very motivating factor for the Senate, so we weren't sure if Republicans were going to take that deal. And ultimately, Phil, they did not. It's why we're on the air this late in the day. Senate Republicans instead said, no, we are going to stay here, we are going to work this weekend, and we are going to continue to procedurally go through Donald Trump's nominees. That means Kristi Noem is next up. She's going to have a procedural vote tonight, and then she's on track for her official confirmation vote on Sunday morning around 5 a.m. Sunday morning. I know, 5 a.m. Sunday morning. And then, of course, the Senate is going to kick off a busy week next week of confirmation hearings, where we have RFK Jr. up on the Hill, Donald Trump's pick to run the Department of Health and Human Services, who wants to overhaul that agency. Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump's pick to be the Director of National Intelligence, who's going to be at the nexus of the American intelligence community. And Kash Patel, Donald Trump's pick to run the FBI, who wants to overhaul that agency and has openly mused over the years about using the federal government to go after Donald Trump's political opponents. Those are 3 of Donald Trump's most controversial cabinet picks, and they will have their hearings this week, all while the Senate tries to move on the floor this first tranche of nominees and get votes on Noem, get votes on Scott Bessent, who's Donald Trump's pick to run the Treasury, and other nominees to try to fill up this Trump cabinet, Phil.
Yeah, and overhauling seems to be an overarching theme of this administration and what some of these nominees want to do. Jay, I'm curious. Kamala Harris, who was vice president in the last administration, had voted a number of times, a record-breaking, tie-breaking votes. I'm wondering if you think this is the first of many. That was the question you posed, but I'm wondering if you think this is the first of many for J.D. Vance.
I mean, it's very, very, very possible, Phil, because I think the thing is...
they're clapping, Jay. It looks like...
Yeah, let's see. What's going on the floor, Phil? You have a closer view of it than I do.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We'll take it full. I just saw a bunch of people clap, a bunch of the senators clap, so I figured J.D. Vance was on his way in.
Hey,
he did
so
just
Phil,
sit down. Yeah, he sat down. He's there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there he is. Yep. So we should see him make his vote. There they get on him. You see him, Jay.
Change a vote. If not, on this vote, the yeas are 50 and the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative, and the nomination is confirmed.
All right, so there you have it. J.D. Vance coming in, making the tie-breaking vote. It wasn't the robust clapping that you can hear from a lot of times from one side or the other, but this was split right down the middle, and they're looking up toward the gallery. It looks like clapping for Hegseth, who rather unusually chose to be there with his family, but now gets to celebrate as that. Let's listen into Senator Thune.
And lay it upon the table, and the president be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Further, that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Noem nomination be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Kristi Noem of South Dakota to be Secretary of Homeland Security. Signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Kristi Noem of South Dakota to be Secretary of Homeland Security shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
All right, so Jay, I want to bring you back in. We got more than just the passing of Pete Hegseth's confirmation there. They talked, as you said, about Kristi Noem. I think you said that vote's going to happen at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, but there's going to be no debate on whether or not they're going to have the vote, right?
You set them up, knock them down, Phil. We're just trying to get these done fast in the Senate. So now they're teeing up a procedural vote on Kristi Noem, which, if/when it passes, because it will pass, will then begin what's called the procedural clock in the Senate. I won't bore you with it, but essentially it puts us on track for Kristi Noem's official vote to be sometime early Sunday morning, again, 4-5 a.m. So once this vote passes, it starts that clock, and then the Senate has to come back Sunday morning and officially vote to confirm Noem. And they're doing all of this because they're trying to move very quickly to install Donald Trump's cabinet, particularly because they're under pressure from Republicans in their own ranks, particularly further right Republicans, to do this fast. Some have issued statements saying that they don't believe this process is happening fast enough. And frankly, they're under pressure from the White House too, Phil. And one more thing, we just got a statement from Mitch McConnell, who walks us through why he cast that 11th hour no vote against Pete Hegseth. I just want to give you a snapshot of a little bit of what McConnell said, because it is at times a scathing statement. He says, effective management of nearly 3 million military and civilian personnel, an annual budget of nearly $1 trillion, and alliances and partnerships around the world is a daily test with staggering consequences for the security of the American people and our global interests. He's talking about what the Secretary of Defense has to do. Quote, Mr. Hegseth has failed as yet to demonstrate that he will pass this test. That was Mitch McConnell there demonstrating why he's a no vote on Pete Hegseth. So far in this statement, and I've gone through it, he doesn't talk as much about controversial elements of Hegseth's past or Hegseth's comments about women in combat, but instead he seems to indicate in this lengthy statement that he doesn't feel that Hegseth has the requisite experience to lead the Department of Defense. But nonetheless, Phil, we saw J.D. Vance cast that tie-breaking vote. Hegseth will lead the Department of Defense.
All right, and I want to get some reaction on that. I want to bring Amanda and Matt back into the conversation. This went the way it seemed it was going to go, even though we had a little bit of a surprise there, sort of surprise from Mitch McConnell. I'm wondering, Amanda, as Jay says, set him up and knock him down. They've already got the clock started on Kristi Noem and her nomination. Do you think what happened tonight sets a path for these nominees, sets an easier path for them?
Well, you saw a vote come through, and so it in some ways it does, because you now have the math and people were willing on such a tough candidate who people didn't feel were qualified, including Mitch McConnell. I think it is unfortunate that his letter, his conversation about, or his discussion, what is in that letter about his worries and concern about this candidate should have been expressed before. I mean, this is the kind of important conversation that usually senators have prior to the vote because it's supposed to be a discussion. Now, I think people were willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt and his nominee the benefit of the doubt. We will see. It's likely to mean the other candidates are going to come through pretty easily because of that, because this one was one of the harder ones. I'll just make one other point, though. If you have senators who are looking at the full breadth of our intelligence, you might say, okay, we let Pete through, but we're going to take another look at Tulsi Gabbard because we want to make sure that we are very comfortable in that role given this nomination now.
And Matt, what about that? Amanda makes the point that it would have been nice for Mitch McConnell to maybe get that statement out and bring some people on board that way. It seems like he chose pretty specifically not to do that. I'm wondering why you think he did it that way.
Very intentionally, I think, to do a couple things. Number one, if you look at the last line of the statement, he even alludes to the fact that he knew he wasn't going to be able to stop him. He mentions about Hegseth yet hasn't done what he needed to do, alluding there was a future that he could prove it and that he would be confirmed as secretary. I think plainly, again, it goes back to my point. He obviously timed it with Tillis to take some pressure off him. Think of it this way. If McConnell comes out, say last night or earlier today, and says he's going to vote it against Hegseth, suddenly Tom Tillis is ground zero for the battle. It depends with him. And so it takes, by doing this after Tillis, takes pressure off him for being the sole decider of this, and in many ways takes a little heat off him in a contentious Senate race next year.
And Matt, Amanda has a really interesting point. Does this perhaps give someone the ability to, on, say, a Tulsi Gabbard, who comes in with a different set of baggage, does it give someone the ability to then say, hey, to the White House, I said yes to Hegseth, but I can't do this? Do you think that happens, or do people just fall in line here?
Look, the people that were going to say no to the White House, again, barring any surprises, were the people who voted no and said no to the White House this time. But again, RFK, Tulsi, and Kash Patel haven't had their hearings yet. So that will be very interesting to see. Again, we'll see what comes up. If there's any gaffes, any issues there, that could change things. But it also goes back to the point Amanda made and I made earlier, where kind of the bank of reservoir of voting no on these things, especially if you're Susan Collins, you're even Lisa Murkowski, is not endless. You can't vote against all four. You can't. It's a fact. Maybe one, certainly, maybe two. Then you're pushing it. That's something to think about, too.
Amanda, how do the Democrats move forward? And I don't mean the bigger conversation about what happened to the Democratic Party after the election, but I mean moving forward and working with a Pete Hegseth, who no Democrat in the Senate voted for. Obviously, as you mentioned, they want this person to succeed because he's running the Defense Department for this country. But how does it become tricky when more and more of these nominees get in that the Democrats just don't want to work with?
Listen, I think what you're going to find is people take their role of oversight quite seriously and will be watching. And I think that's true, actually, not just because this vote was so close, not just for Democrats, but Republicans who also took some long time or they didn't share exactly their angst. I think this nominee is going to be watched very closely because people are worried exactly about what McConnell said. And it does behoove all of us that they began to build a relationship with them to help either guide, advise, support. But it's important that this role, this particular position is successful and that the relationship becomes a productive one from here on out.
And Matt, how receptive to that kind of oversight do you think President Trump and the White House will be?
I mean, look, oversight's a part of their job. Hegseth knows that. And like I said, this is done once he's confirmed. But that being said, again, it's done. So Hegseth also shouldn't hold this against people that voted against him, whether the Democrats or also Republicans, right? Up in Maine, there are some military installations that he needs to pay attention to that Susan Collins it represents. So I think, look, it behooves both sides to leave this alone, and oversight will happen as it should, and you move on.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens with the other nominees. It's not just the Senate working this weekend. Jay and I will be working this weekend as well. Amanda, Matt, thank you both very much. Appreciate it. And a good evening to all of you. If you're just joining us, I'm Phil Lipoff in for Lindsay Davis tonight. Thanks so much for streaming with us. Just moments ago, the Senate narrowly confirmed President Trump's controversial pick for Secretary of Defense, former Fox News host Pete Hegseth.
The yeas are 50 and the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative, and the nomination is confirmed.
That was Vice President J.D. Vance reading the vote, also casting the tie. Vance was called on to cast the tie-breaking vote for the first time in his vice presidency. After former Republican leader Mitch McConnell joined fellow Republicans Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, the voting against Hegseth, all the Senate Democrats voted no. Hegseth is now cleared to lead the Pentagon with the narrowest of support from Capitol Hill. As you just saw, I want to bring back in Jay O'Brien. Jay, walk us through how all this came together tonight.
Yeah, Phil, we always knew that there were two no votes against Pete Hegseth, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, two moderate Republican senators, but we weren't sure if there were any others. And then at the 11th hour, as that vote is underway, the cameras captured Mitch McConnell, the former Senate Republican leader, now a prominent senator still and an influential senator of Kentucky, walking up, casting his vote, putting his thumb down and saying that he too was a no on Pete Hegseth. Now, McConnell saying that he had concerns about Hegseth's fitness for that job, about his level of experience. Murkowski and Collins said they had similar concerns, but also said they were worried about Pete Hegseth's background, about accusations, for instance, of sexual assault from 2017, which Hegseth denies, about Hegseth's previous comments about opposing women in combat, which Hegseth has since walked back. All of that to say a dramatic moment there. Mitch McConnell tying it up 50-50. And then, as you saw, J.D. Vance, the vice president, having to walk into the Senate chamber, cast the tie-breaking vote, his first tie-breaking vote as vice president just days into the job, and confirming Pete Hegseth to be the next Secretary of Defense, Phil.
It's a big job, and I'm wondering what you think this means for Pete Hegseth. 3 million people in the Defense Department. Clearly, just like the split in the Senate, not all of them are going to be happy about his appointment. What happens? What happens with Pete Hegseth as head of that department?
He takes the reins, Phil, of the nation's largest employer, as you said, 3 million people, including active duty service members, reservists, as well as civilians who work for the Department of Defense. And one of the things that those 3 Republicans in opposition to him, as well as every single Democrat, have pointed out in talking about their opposition to Pete Hegseth, is that he's never run an organization even nearly of that size. But Pete Hegseth said he's ready to do it. He champions the fact that he's an outsider and he can bring that outsider perspective to the Pentagon to bring back what he says is the quote-unquote warrior ethos that the organization needs. But he's got a tall order put out for him because he's promising substantive changes at the Department of Defense, substantive changes that President Trump wants. Now it remains to be seen if he'll be able to pull that off, Phil.
And just quickly, Jay, what's next for the confirmations? The Senate's working this weekend.
Yeah, the Senate's trying to move quickly through these Trump nominees, Phil. They've got a vote for Kristi Noem, Trump's pick to run the Department of Homeland Security, teed up for very early Sunday morning around 4 a.m. And then they're going to breeze through a series of controversial cabinet selection hearings, confirmation hearings, rather, this week, including Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump's pick to be the Director of National Intelligence, Kash Patel, Donald Trump's pick to run the FBI, and RFK Jr., Donald Trump's pick to run the Department of Health and Human Services. All have promised serious overhauls to their agencies and roles, expected to get grilled by lawmakers this week about all of that, Phil.
All right, Jay, thanks. We know you'll be covering it all for us. Joining me now is ABC contributor Amanda Renteria, who is a Democratic strategist, CEO of Code America. Also, Matt Gorman, former senior communications advisor to Senator Tim Scott. Thank you both for being back. Amanda, I want to start with you. We just saw, you just watched with us, Vice President J.D. Vance cast that tie-breaking vote to confirm Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. I'm wondering if there's anything about this evening's events that surprised you.
Really, McConnell's late vote, as well as his pretty scathing statement and concern that he's actually expressing about Pete's leadership here. That's unusual to hear from a former Senate Majority Leader. And also just that the White House, Vance Vice President J.D. Vance wasn't ready for it. Usually those kinds of things are worked out beforehand so that everybody knows the dance and that there's no embarrassment and there's no waiting until the middle of the night in order to have someone come in for a late-minute vote. So that was a surprise to me. But I have a feeling that in this administration and really this last week, we're going to see a heck of a lot more surprises, given the speed with which people are moving and the unusual nature of a lot of these candidates that we're going to now see come one at a time, maybe even over the weekends.
Matt, we've heard a lot of back and forth from both Democrats and Republicans on why they would or wouldn't support him. What stuck out to you when you were reading about the various reasons senators said that they wouldn't vote for his confirmation?
I mean, look, I thought, McConnell's statement was pretty long, pretty scathing. And again, that was probably the one surprise. At the end of the day, again, it didn't change anything. Vance was there ready to go with the tiebreaker. I think the length at which he did it, I thought was surprising to me. Collins' statement talking about not just she opposed him, but didn't believe him, I thought was an interesting tact as well. Those two really stuck out at me, and not just why they voted against it, but in some ways very acute reasons why they voted against Hegseth.
Amanda, despite a slew of allegations of sexual misconduct, excessive drinking, the Senate, with the help, obviously, the tie-breaking vote, Vice President J.D. Vance still confirmed Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. I'm wondering if you think this says anything about the Senate as an institution, or perhaps where it is at this moment, or just the political climate that we're living in.
Well, I think it says a couple of things. One is Trump is using the momentum from the election and really pushing as fast as he can. And that really does make it difficult for a Senate body that is used to taking some time to think through this, having discussions and deliberations. And so I think the strategy here, if you think about it from that perspective, was different, and it worked to bring forward a candidate that you can feel and see that people have had a lot of anxiety about. That's going to be somewhat of a message to how does this administration move forward? Are they using different and unusual tactics, and does it work? So I think this particular evening, this particular week is really setting the stage that this is a different era of governing. This is a different era of the relationship between the Senate and the White House, given the closeness of this vote. And we're going to see what that means for how this body, Senate body, interacts with the White House as it moves forward.
And Matt, you and Amanda both have talked about that bank of no votes. You only have so many you can go to politically. I want to talk to you about political capital. This president has said, and by the numbers, comes into office in his second term as, with a mandate and with the support of the majority of this country, or at least those who voted. And I'm wondering what you think, how far this kind of political capital will go. Say it goes through all the rest of his nominees. How far, at what point do you have to start showing results before you've spent your political capital?
I mean, to kind of start, political capital is really only spent on actual policy priorities, right? It's not, you don't waste it, you don't really gain it on nominees. For example, Bill Clinton went through 2 attorneys general nominees, failed before getting the third. It didn't really affect how he got what he needed to done in his first term. So what will be really be determinative for the Trump term will be what he can get through on immigration, taxes, and the economy, whether that's 1 bill or 2. And that will really be how at least the first year, maybe the first 2 years, are candidly judged.
All right, Matt, thanks very much. Matt and Amanda, I appreciate it. I do just want to read you this. We've got a statement in from President Trump. He was asked about it, and he said, and I'll quote him, "We just heard that we have a great Secretary of Defense. We're very happy about that, and we appreciate everyone's votes." He was asked what he thought about Mitch McConnell voting no, and his response was, "I didn't know that. I just know we won. I didn't know that." So at the end of the day, he and his team at the White House are obviously very happy about this. Again, Amanda and Matt, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. President Trump just left California tonight after touring fire damage. He and First Lady Melania Trump went into impacted neighborhoods. You see some of the pictures here, shook hands with people who were impacted. At a press conference, President Trump declared that the fires are a national emergency.
I don't think you can realize how rough it is, how devastating it is until you see it.
About an hour earlier, President Trump touched down in Los Angeles and was greeted by Governor Gavin Newsom. As you see here, the two men shaking hands. The two have a long history. It's a war of words, but of course, from a distance, opposite sides of the country. Today, the two spoke face to face.
Most importantly, thank you for being here. It means a great deal to all of us, and not just the folks in Palisades, but folks in Altadena that were devastated. We're going to need your support. We're going to need your help.
Trump has threatened to withhold disaster aid if California fails to meet certain conditions. The president flew directly from Asheville, North Carolina, where many are still, as you know, recovering from the devastation left behind by Hurricane Helene. While in North Carolina, he pledged support for hurricane recovery, but also signaled he may make major changes to FEMA or perhaps even eliminate it if he could. ABC's Melissa Adon is in Pacific Palisades, where she spoke to a lawmaker in the room during that President Trump roundtable.
Phil, a big emphasis on President Trump's visit here to Southern California was on rebuilding. That's something that Trump says when he spoke to homeowners, they brought up questions as to how long will the rebuilding process take. He says that there was a couple he spoke to that said 18 months is what they were hearing. And he brought that up to Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass. And when they did that, they had a back and forth there that Karen Bass is vowing to cut the red tape as well. This is something that Trump says he wants to do. He says he's already been on the phone with developers wanting to get them here immediately to start building ASAP. However, as the Los Angeles mayor pointed out, right now there's already in several phases of this process, which has involved the EPA clearing out these hazardous waste materials, then making sure they can remove the debris. And then after that, they're looking at the basic rebuilding process. However, local officials here are also worried by that. They don't want it to be a year and a half for rebuilding. They want this to be as quick as possible. Representative Judy Chu, she represents the areas of Altadena and Pasadena. They were impacted by the Eaton fire. I spoke with her about this and what concerns her residents are right now facing. We're joined now by Judy Chu. She's a representative of areas in Altadena and Pasadena that were impacted by the Eaton fire. That is just where so many thousands of families have been impacted and are now trying to work to rebuild, move forward. But it is a long road ahead. You were inside the meeting right now with President Trump. What was your reaction and the message that you got across?
I wanted to make sure that President Trump did not forget Altadena and Pasadena. I do give him credit because he gave his all in terms of coming here within 3 days of his inauguration. And I know that it was so important for him to acknowledge the wildfires and to see the devastation for himself. But I wanted to make sure he knew how special Altadena and Pasadena was, and that the devastation there was apocalyptic. I mean, 9,500 structures burned, 17 people died, thousands of people are without homes, and they need help. And so I said to him, we need the disaster aid. We need to make sure that people can rebuild and that this community can be the wonderful place it once was.
And Representative Chu, what are the biggest issues and obstacles that your residents tell you they're facing right now?
Well, right now, they are just getting through the FEMA disaster assistance process. Initially, the biggest problem was getting these non-approval notices from FEMA. We complained about it on their behalf, and they said that they have changed this system now so that it more accurately says we need more information on your insurance or something like that. But then we're getting into the debris removal process. And right now, EPA is going through the hazardous removal. But debris removal will be a whole other issue. And we need to make sure that they get the funds that they need to do that. And then there's the whole rebuilding process. And I think that's where we are going to need that federal assistance as they go through this. And I want to make sure that our Altadena and Pasadena folks can learn from the lessons of Paradise